So let's go over some of the adaptations that are unique to plants that contain seeds. When compared with seedless plants, seed plants have a highly reduced gametophyte or haploid portion of their life cycle. Each separate male and female gametophyte is reduced to a cluster of only a few cells. And that gametophyte is present for only a short duration of the entire plant life cycle. This microscopic gametophyte is also housed within the parent diploid sporophyte. So consider how different this is to the gametophyte of the fern that's free living on the forest floor. Fertilization occurs between the male and female cells, known as ovules and pollen, and their structure is also unique to seeded plants. Fertilization occurs inside of the female structure of the parent plant, and the parent plant provides nutrients to the developing embryo. So consider that all land plants develop from embryos, but cell division of a newly fertilized zygote and cellular specialization of the embryo begins before that embryo is separated from the parent plant. Now, this is not the case in the seedless plants that begin to divide after dispersal of the spores. So, seed plants have a lot of important evolutionary advantages, and as a result, they've become much more diverse and much more common than the seedless or the non-vascular plants. Recall that the seedless plants are dependent upon water for their life cycle. The spores of seedless plants are also somewhat water resistant, but a seed provides an especially tough protective coat that not only provides superior protection against desiccation or drying out, but it also contains a package of food resources for the developing embryo. Seeds have an amazing ability to remain dormant for an extremely long period of time. So a seed can wait until the conditions are favorable for germination. Okay. Most spores have some ability to wait a few days or weeks after dispersal, but generally they don't remain viable for as long as a seed. In fact, I've got an interesting story about an extremely long period of dormancy in a seed. I once had a friend who was studying a rare plant in New Jersey. It lived along beaches, and it was endangered due to the fact that there's so much activity on beaches and so much human disturbance. The plant was known to exist in southern beaches, like in North Carolina, but it had not been seen in New Jersey for many years. All of a sudden, botanists started to notice new populations popping up along the coast, and it was a bit of a mystery. Scientists weren't sure where they'd come from. It was possible that their seeds had been dispersed, but with the nearest population in North Carolina, that seemed highly unlikely. The scientists eventually determined that the seeds had remained viable offshore underneath the sand that was covered by the ocean. That sand later piled up on shores as cities and towns completed beach nourishment projects. Okay, they were trying to get more sand up on the beach for recreation after it had been lost due to erosion. Along with the sand, the seeds had been pumped back up on the shore and gave birth to new populations of this plant that hadn't been seen in that area for tens of years. Okay, I think it's quite remarkable that the seeds could remain viable in such an environment. Another important adaptation of seeds is that water is no longer necessary for reproduction. Remember that the diploid stage of seedless plants can only form after swimming sperm reaches the female gametophyte. Male sex cells of seed plants are called pollen, and they are resistant to drying out. Seed plants have a number of extremely advantageous adaptations for getting that pollen to the female portion of a plant. So the independence of seed plants from water has allowed them to grow to really amazing heights. Okay, and here I've shown a picture of the world record's tallest tree. Okay, it's a coast redwood found in California, and it reaches a height of 379 feet. That's pretty amazing. The largest tree by volume is a giant sequoia, which is a member of the same family of trees as the coast redwoods. It's pictured here in this picture, and I think it's kind of cute that the park rangers have given it a nickname, General Sherman. As I mentioned earlier, the seed plants are divided into two monophyletic clades, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The common ancestor of these two groups, the reproductive structures in the common ancestors of these two groups were similar to that of the existing gymnosperms. A number of gymnosperms remain on Earth today, and they're particularly abundant in the northern latitudes, especially the boreal forests. They're extremely well adapted to dry environments, not only because of the adaptations that all seed plants have in common, but also because their leaves have been reduced to tough, needle-like structures that have reduced the possibility of water loss. Most of the gymnosperms that we're familiar with belong to a group called the conifers, and they get their name because their reproductive structures are cones, just like the familiar pine cone. So these include groups like the spruce, pine, fir, and redwoods. It also includes a couple of plants that you might not be so familiar with. The cycads that look kind of like a primitive palm tree, and the ginkgo with its fan-shaped leaf. A lot of gymnosperms hold world records for plants. Just like the coast redwood and the giant redwood that are the largest in volume and the tallest, we also have the bristlecone pine within the gymnosperms, and it's the oldest tree known on Earth. The oldest individuals appear to be about 4,600 years old. So when you see those jokes that say things like 40 or 50 or 60 isn't old if you're a tree, they're really not kidding. So in a later section, we'll go over the reproduction of the angiosperms, the flowering plants, in great detail. So now let's go over the reproductive life cycle of a gymnosperm. Okay, it's very similar to the reproductive life cycle of an angiosperm, although the angiosperms do have some unique features. Okay, so remember that the dominant structure, the one we're all familiar with, the pine tree, is a diploid sporophyte. And these sporophytes have both male and female cones. The male cones are much smaller, as represented by this picture of the small yellow structures. And the female cones are the large pine cones with which we're familiar. So the cells within the male cone that eventually give rise to the male sex cells called the pollen are called sporangia. Because the parent is diploid and the tree needs to produce haploid spores, as you should know, the process that needs to occur is meiosis. Okay, remember that reduces the number of chromosomes in half. The cells within the female also undergo meiosis, and the precursor to the female gamete is known as the megasporangium. Okay, because it's much larger than the male sporangium, which can also be called a microsporangium. Okay, so see here that here's one section of a pine cone. We have a diploid sporangium and a diploid spore cell, which will eventually divide to become the female gamete. And it's housed within this structure called the ovule. The outer covering of the sporangium that protects it is known as the integument. Okay, we then have the female gametophyte, the megaspore, undergoing meiosis to produce the haploid eggs. Meiosis has occurred separately in the male cone, producing these pollen grains that each contain 2 sperm. Okay, so the male gametophyte has been reduced to a 2-cell structure. Okay, a small tube forms within the female sporangium and allows access of pollen to the female gametophyte. These 2 haploid cells fuse. A diploid cell is produced through the process of fertilization. And just like in animals, this single diploid cell is called the zygote. So this zygote undergoes cellular division and the beginnings of cellular differentiation. So while the embryo is still within the parent plant, it has some rudimentary structures that resemble basic leaves and roots. That seed can then be dispersed to an appropriate location, and when the conditions are appropriate, it grows into an individual that's independent from the parent plant. Eventually, that individual matures and the cycle begins all over again. Okay, in case you had trouble seeing the small type, or you want to look at what happens in more detail, when fertilization occurs within a pine cone, here's a more detailed structure. Notice the female haploid gametophyte surrounded by the protective integument, and this little gap here gives room for the pollen grain to enter. Then a passageway called a pollen tube forms and allows the pollen to reach the female gametophyte. That fertilized zygote then develops into an embryo, and this close-up picture shows how a large amount of food is available to that developing embryo between the time of fertilization and germination. Okay, so now let's talk about the group called the angiosperms. Okay, angiosperms have seeds in common with gymnosperms, but angiosperms have two adaptations, flowers and fruits, that are absent in gymnosperms. The flower of a plant is actually the reproductive structure, and the flower has specialized sexual structures that facilitate reproduction and attract pollinators, which are sometimes necessary for fertilization. Angiosperms are an extremely successful and diverse group. As soon as they evolved, they rapidly underwent a period of diversification. Can you remember the name of that phenomenon that occurs when a new adaptation results in rapid diversification? Okay, it's called adaptive radiation. And we saw that occurring shortly after the appearance of the first flowering plants in the fossil record. Currently, there are about 250,000 species of flowering plants worldwide, and 90% of all described plant species are flowering plants. Just go to a nice place like Ginter Gardens and enjoy their beauty and diversity. They also provide important food supplies for humans. Nearly all of the fruits and vegetables that we eat, including the grains, come from flowering plants. The evolution of angiosperms is somewhat of a mystery. During Darwin's time, there were few fossils available that showed the steps that occurred between gymnosperm and angiosperm evolution. Since that time, we've discovered more fossils and conducted a number of DNA studies that have allowed for successful phylogenetic analysis. But we still don't understand the evolution of the angiosperms quite as thoroughly as we understand the evolution of many other groups. They first appear in the fossil record about 140 million years ago. And it might be the fact that their adaptations were so successful and that they underwent such rapid evolution that we've had difficulty finding fossils that provide a clear understanding of every important step involved in the evolution of the first flowering plants. Okay, so I certainly don't expect you to memorize all of the different groups of the flowering plants, but let's just look at this phylogeny and some of the associated pictures that illustrate just a tiny portion of the diversity and the beauty found in the different flowering plant groups. The two groups that you want to be familiar with are the monocots and the eudicots. We'll talk about them a little bit more later in this unit.